What's it all about? For the first time since 2009, North Korea shooting a missile over Japan, a rocket test that highlights how helpless civilians would be if it was the real thing. Attention-seeking behavior that comes days after the U.S. downplayed failed launches by Pyongyang. The U.S. hoping there would be an opening to dialogue. Instead, it's now over to the United Nations, where yet more sanctions are on the table. However, China already hinting that that won't be happening. How to handle Pyongyang? Can there be a concerted approach? More broadly, what have we learned from what's been so far a summer of saber-rattling and military maneuvers? Can the leaders we have keep us safe? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what the options on the table are. With us, Dorian Malovic, Asia editor for French newspaper La Croix. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
Co-author of the book North Korea in 100 Questions, a handy read.
Yes.
Updated version.
Updated in July and reprinted. So
in French.
In French.
So
yeah.
far.
Still expecting an English publisher.
Okay.
It will come.
All right. We're also pleased to welcome John Nielsen-Wright, Senior Lecturer in Japanese Politics and International Relations at Cambridge University, also with the think tank Chatham House. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we also want to welcome from Woodbridge, Virginia, Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It was 6:02 a.m. local time. Residents of the Japanese island of Hokkaido jolted by the following text message alert: missile launch, missile launch. North Korea appears to have fired a missile. Take refuge in a solid building or underground. Turns out the rocket sailed clear over the mainland and into the Pacific Ocean, with the fallout diplomatic at this point. Catherine Viette has more.
A daring ballistic missile launch from North Korea has left its regional neighbors furious. The rockets, which flew over the Japanese island of Hokkaido, ups the ante over its banned nuclear weapons program.
This missile launch by North Korea is an unprecedented, serious and grave threat.
The Japanese Prime Minister spoke with Donald Trump, who again warned North Korea.
Threatening and destabilizing actions only increase the North Korean regime's isolation in the region and among all nations of the world. All options are on the table.
The U.S. is carrying out military exercises with both Japan and South Korea. The annual drills are seen as a provocation by North Korea. Despite the universal condemnation, North Korea has defended its actions.
It is an undeniable fact that U.S. is driving the station of Korean Peninsula towards extreme level of explosion by deploying huge strategic assets around the peninsula to conduct series of nuclear war drills and maintaining nuclear threats and blackmail for over a half-century.
Meanwhile, its ally China has again urged restraint, calling for those involved to end the malicious cycle of escalating tensions.
John Nielsen-Wright, let me begin with you and just the specifics of this. I mean, it's happened in the past, but it hasn't happened since 2009. What do you think of the Japanese reaction?
I think the reaction from Japan is very predictable. We heard a very strong statement from Prime Minister Abe, underlining, I think, his irritation, his frustration, his awareness of the gravity and the vulnerability of Japan, and the fact that a warning was issued to ordinary Japanese citizens about the need to take cover is, I think, a clear confirmation of just how vulnerable Japan is to the threat from North Korea. As you mentioned,
there was a feeling, though, of helplessness. I read a story of Japanese fishermen saying, well, there's nothing we could do. We just continued fishing because what could we do?
Exactly. I mean, if you think about Japan's defenses, Japan has Patriot missile batteries, but they're designed to deal with an attack targeted at individual Japanese cities, such as Tokyo. An overflight, such as this missile, doesn't really provide the Japanese independently with any opportunity to shoot it down. Even if they could as well, they would have to think very carefully about the risks of doing that, because if they were to attempt to shoot it down with the support of their American partners and missed, it would effectively undermine their entire deterrent.
Because they had threatened beforehand, saying, watch out, if you do this, we'll shoot it down.
Well, there have been noises that the Americans might have been able to do that, but Japan doesn't have that independent capability. There are real constitutional constraints on what it can do. And now we're hearing, and have been in recent weeks, from Japanese defense planners who have been saying Japan needs cruise missiles. It needs the ability to target North Korean potential missile attacks before they actually happen. So to attack preemptively, or to attack a missile before its launch or just on the point of launch. But the problem with that strategy is, A, it's a medium to long-term strategy. It would take time, it would take resources. Japan, of course, is a country heavily indebted and therefore is not in a position to spend a lot more on its military. But there are also real important constitutional questions about whether Japan can attack in that sort of way. Its whole defense strategy is premised on defense only, not this sort of offensive approach. So for now, the Japanese have no military option. They're reliant on the United States, and therefore I think what we're going to see from Mr. Abe is a focus on sanctions and political pressure on North Korea.
What does public opinion think? Because Japan, like Germany, post-World War II, a strong pacifist tradition, as you saying, things in the Constitution to make it a defense-only army, and yet we have this nationalist prime minister.
I think Japanese public opinion, first of all, looks at North Korea and sees a very unpredictable, hostile country. You have to remember, in the context of history, Japan, of course, occupied the Korean peninsula for 35 years. Koreans, both north and south, harbour, I think, a deep-seated suspicion, if not resentment, of Japan. And North Koreans, fueled by public propaganda, supported by their state, play on that. This is a country that the North Koreans really despise. And so the Japanese are worried about that. And think back to the 1970s and 80s. North Korean special agents covertly kidnapped Japanese civilians, somewhere in the region of perhaps 80 individuals. That's an issue, one which Prime Minister Abe has put himself full square behind resolving, that really concerns ordinary Japanese citizens. So that, coupled with the new strategic threat from North Korea, means that for the average Japanese citizen, North Korea is the most prominent, real and present danger.
Anthony Ruggiero, if you're Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, how do you respond? What do you do? And what's your strategy for the long term?
Well, I think it's a dangerous escalation by North Korea. I think it shows the value of the rhetoric that the president and Secretary Mattis were putting forward earlier this year. North Korea needs to understand that there are consequences for their actions, whether it's a missile test overflying Japan or attacking South Korea, which is what they've done previously. So in terms of Japan, they have called for stronger sanctions. I think Prime Minister Abe should talk to the Russian president and tell them to stop evading sanctions and violating U.S. sanctions law. They should, I think one thing that has been unnoticed is that Russian companies and individuals are actually aiding North Korea's proliferation programs. That was revealed by the U.S. Treasury Department over the last couple of months. It's the same thing with China. I think Prime Minister Abe could very clearly push for additional sanctions against China. But at the end of the day, he's not going to get those at the UN. I know that that's what he called for, but Russia and China are not going to allow the level of pressure necessary at the UN.
And should there be a more militarized Japan?
In terms of a militarized Japan, there's, how can we argue against that? I think that, North Korea has very clearly demonstrated by this missile overflight and also by its other types of rhetoric. They've practiced other attacks on a Japanese military base. We all are very, here in the United States, are very concerned about the recent intelligence leaks about ICBM and nuclear weapons that can fit on those. That's something that Japan and South Korea have been under threat for many years now. So I think, certainly if Japan and its politicians feel like they need to spend more on the military to defend themselves, I think that's something the United States should support.
Dorian Malik, you agree?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm just back from a 3-week trip in Japan, all around the country, and it was just in August when there was the Trump saying the fury and fear and the escalation again, like in April. And I watched TV. And in fact, every day on TV, even though there is not much to say on North Korea, you have a North Korean topic in the news related to South Korea, related to to Trump, related to China. So slowly the people I talked to were saying that we are more and more afraid. I mean, the anxiousness is growing, but it's like the NHK TV is contributing also every day, and the Yomiuri Shimbun or some conservative newspaper also are pushing always in the same direction that North Korea is a devil, North Korea is dangerous, we must defend ourselves. It looks like, even though I'm not a specialist as you are, but it looks though that the pressure is mounting and that for Abe, the need to rearm, to arm again, I mean, to have missile, radar, defense, and also to change this pacifist constitution is still in Shinzo Abe's objective.
And what sense did you get from ordinary Japanese citizens on that?
I mean, they were just, watching the media and reading the newspaper. I don't know whether now it's not a majority of Japanese would agree on changing the constitution, but still, younger people tend to be a little bit more nationalistic, a little bit, but some other people who were not that much would tend to agree that we have to defend more ourselves. And with Trump, unreliable, we cannot rely definitely the same way on the US as before. That would be my summarizing.
I think you're right. I think there's a sense in which there's a growing exasperation amongst ordinary Japanese citizens. An unprincipled leader could exploit that to try and push the envelope in terms of constitutional change. But I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which the support for the peace constitution is still very strong.
I agree.
Mr. Abe, of course, we shouldn't forget, is now politically, his popularity has dropped dramatically on the back of a couple of important corruption scandals. And there are limits to what Japan can do. This is an immediate crisis. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that what the Japanese need to start thinking about is not in any way minimizing the importance of deterrence, and that if that involves spending more money on the military, that might be a good thing. But we shouldn't forget, in 2002, then Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro traveled to Pyongyang, the first post-war Japanese Prime Minister to do that, to talk about the possibility of normalization, of talks, of re-engaging with North Korea. He followed it up in 2004. Many people at the time thought this was a very important step forward. Now, Mr. Abe has said today there is no immediate prospect of talking. This is not the time for engagement. But we shouldn't forget, ultimately, if we're going to resolve this situation, there will have to be talks, not only between the US and Pyongyang, but also other countries. Japan, if it were to normalize its relationship with North Korea, would, if you take the formula of 2002, be offering North Korea somewhere between $5 and $10 billion worth of assistance. That's a very significant economic incentive to North Korea. Kim Jong-un not only wants to modernize his military, he wants to promote economic development. Japan would be the key to that. It's a long way down the pike, but I think we shouldn't forget the constructive role that Japan could play in all of this.
Why did North Korea fire this missile? Was it because of the military drills that are taking place both in Japan and South Korea?
I think the Japanese did this for three reasons. The North Koreans did this for three reasons. First and foremost, the technical need to test their capabilities, to demonstrate that they're making progress. We've heard about the success in July of those two ICBM launches, but the North Koreans are not yet in a position where they have genuinely a reliable deterrent that can strike at the United States. That's their bottom line. That's what Kim Jong-un wants. The second reason is to send a very clear signal to Donald Trump that despite all of the fiery bluster from the president, they're not deterred. They will continue to test, as they promised back in April, their military hardware. The third reason, I think, behind all of this is that we shouldn't forget, just a few days ago, the Japanese government was saying they would tighten their own bilateral sanctions. This is a way for Pyongyang to send a signal to Abe that you will not intimidate us. And so I think it's a complex mix of factors.
All right, military maneuvers taking place in Japan, taking place as well this Tuesday in South Korea. Now, Australian public broadcaster ABC reports that the South Korean defense minister has said he would discuss the temporary placement of additional THAAD launchers. Those are those anti-ballistic missile shields with U.S. military commanders stationed in South Korea, something that the new president had been against when he was on the campaign trail. Seoul conducting a live fire drill this Tuesday, complete with F-15 fighter jets.
If North Korea threatens the security of our people and the South Korea-US alliance with nuclear weapons, we will wipe out their leadership with our Air Force's strong strike capability.
Dorian Malovic, the new president had said that
Moon Jae-in, you mean?
Moon Jae-in had struck a more conciliatory tone on the campaign trail when it came to the North.
Yes, and still a few days ago, he say we are still open for dialogue, and we try to find a way to open the dialogue. Even the foreign minister, Kang, the woman said, we still have a way to find the door open to talk. But then this, for me, those 15 drills are really like a show of helplessness. I mean, they make a drill and bomb their own territory for a drill against a missile that flew over Japan. That means it's a little bit like strange and a little bit contradictory. I mean, they want to show that it's the South Korean Air Force that did it, not the B-1 American or the plane from Japan who flew over the peninsula. But it shows that for me, South Korean is not people to talk to. I mean, they don't want to talk to Seoul anyway.
They don't want to talk to Seoul anyway.
I mean, they consider Washington to be the one, not Seoul. So they don't want to do anything with Seoul.
Anthony Ruggiero, your thoughts on the timing of this missile test and with those drills taking place in Japan and South Korea?
Say one of the additional reasons, I think 3 were mentioned. The reason that was not mentioned is that North Korea wants to unify the peninsula under its own terms, and for their part, perhaps those would be military terms. So, testing a missile such as this, the missile that we think would reach Guam and probably could be used against Japan. There's at least the military, from the North Korean perspective, a military rationale for that. In terms of the South Korean response, I think that South Korea is, again, pointing out what Washington has pointed out, that if North Korea does anything provocative, there will be a military response, unlike in 2010 when North Korea sunk a South Korean naval vessel, killing over 40 sailors. There was really no response, unfortunately, and the North Koreans.
So the South saying that they're going to respond. Anthony, we have to take a very quick break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. North Korea, for the first time since 2009, shooting a missile over Japan, the ballistic missile landing in the Pacific Ocean, and it's triggered a storm of reactions. With us to talk about it, Dorian Malovic, Asia editor for French newspaper La Croix, co-author of North Korea in 100 Questions, re-edited version.
Yes.
Published in French.
Updated.
Soon in English.
We hope so. Yes, thank you.
We hope. All right. The call is out there for editors. Also with us, John Nilsson-Wright, senior lecturer on Japanese politics and international relations at Cambridge University, also with Chatham House, the think tank, and from Woodbridge, Virginia, Anthony Ruggiero, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Anthony, before I rudely interrupted you for the break, you were telling us how, in your view, one of the reasons for this test is a reunified Korea is what Pyongyang wants. Are you suggesting that the regime there wants to refight the Korean War?
I think it's very clear. I mean, North Korea, not only do they want to try and deter the United States and have a nuclear weapon that they can deliver to the U.S. homeland, but they've been very clear in their actions and in their words in saying that they believe that South Korea is a puppet regime of the United States, and they believe they are the true Korean people and that they should rule the entire peninsula. And so I think we have to make sure that we look at least the shorter range, intermediate and below range ballistic missiles, that we remember that those are going to be used in a conflict situation, whether that conflict is started by North Korea or we have a conflict that spirals out of control. So I think there are certainly political reasons to do it, but there are certainly military reasons to do it as well.
John Nilsson-Wright, you agree?
I don't know. I mean, yes, in terms of propaganda, yes, in terms of legitimizing the regime, the idea of unification makes sense. It always has done. It's part of the game plan of the leadership to defend itself in the eyes of its own people. And having an external threat, having a state of war, is one very easy way in which Kim Jong-un wags the dog and therefore creates that climate of collective unity and a sense of common purpose. But the idea that the North Koreans believe a war with South Korea is winnable, I don't see the evidence for that, frankly. And this is much more, I think, an effort to enhance deterrence, shore up the regime and shore up Kim personally, who needs to present himself as the military leader of the country. The irony is that if negotiations were to start, if there was serious dialogue, if the Americans were able to offer the beginning of talks towards a peace treaty and possibly the establishment of a liaison mission and maybe ultimately diplomatic ties, what would happen to that threat that the North Koreans and Kim personally relies on in order to prop up his regime? This is one of the most powerful arguments for dialogue and discussion, beyond the immediate challenge of freezing.
But it's hard to have dialogue and discussion if they're flying missiles over Japan.
Absolutely. So you need a combination. There is no magic bullet. One single approach isn't going to work. So you need a combination of both deterrence and dialogue.
Dorian Malovic, when the White House quotes Donald Trump as saying all options are on the table.
For me, it was the last quote of today, and it sounds like it's back to square one 6 months ago. That's what he said 6 months ago.
So how should the White House have formulated it?
But I think it looks like that nothing happened between, January and August. But a lot happened. And Donald Trump approach, accusing, all options are on the table, accusing China to be responsible. It has to be China. Then, sorry, it's not China not doing enough. So we are doing something. And then now in August, we will send fear and fury. So that means it's back to square one, and it shows the credibility of Donald Trump is really close to zero on the North Korean side. And they say it's a boulevard for Kim Jong-un to keep on testing the missiles, and then the next nuclear test is closer and closer. And then it's going to be like improving the technology. We just realized that the technology jump has been huge from North Korea. Nobody would have expected so the high-speed technology improvement on the North Korean side. I would tend to disagree with Mr. Ruggiero about the war. They don't want to fight a war. They don't want reunification. Reunification is now, according to me, a myth.
They don't want reunification?
I mean, it's like you said, it's propaganda. It's like South Korean in their heart. They want reunification, but the principle of reality is that it's a myth. It was a legend. Now it's a myth. For now, there is no way we can reunify the peninsula. And for now, they want to survive as a state, as a leader. As you said, the nuclear is dissuasion, and they want to protect their own regime. They know that that's their life insurance towards foreign aggression. That's their vision. And it's a long-term, negotiations toward a reunification is a long term before sitting around a table. They cannot agree on some specifics before going to the table. They say, you stop the military drills, South Korea and America, and you stop the test, and we can start talking. Well, nobody would do that. That's the Chinese are suggesting that, but they know it's not possible at the moment. So it looks like very difficult, and unless we have to accept, we have to accept that for now, North Korea has become a nuclear power. It's just a fact. So if you change the approach, it can change completely the approach toward talking to North Korea, and it could be it's another page of history.
Accept the fact, Anthony Ruggiero?
Well, before I get to that, I would just say that I think we're having a very much an underestimation of the North Korean threat. The way it was described, if North Korea's intent is not to reunify the peninsula via military means, then there's no need for their million-man army. There's no need to upgrade their conventional arms, which they are doing. There's no need to test short-range ballistic missile systems like the Scud-based ballistic missile systems. They continue to test and improve. And unfortunately, I can go on and on. I think that there's a focus on the ICBM and the longer-range ballistic missile threat from North Korea while ignoring the shorter range threat to South Korea and Japan, not to mention biological and chemical weapons, whose primary purpose will be to use against South Korean and Japanese citizens, whether they initiate that conflict or that's a retaliation against something else.
But let me just ask you on this point. When Donald Trump talks about all options on the table, of course, we know that's not true because he's not going to fire nuclear missiles at Pyongyang, is he?
I mean, that's not a real scenario. I mean, if North Korea did something that required that response, of course, that option would be on the table. But I think when presidents say that, they mean it. I think that one of the things that happened in the media was this focus on fire and fury and Secretary Mattis saying "game on," but there wasn't as much a focus as on the beginning of those sentences that most of the time said, if North Korea does X, then this will happen. So, I mean, it was clearly in a retaliatory way. I understand how it's more interesting for folks to focus on preemption or prevention, whichever one you want to call it. But that's not what occurred over the last few months. In terms of accepting North Korea as a nuclear state, of course, you know, that has been in existence for more than 10 years, while we focus in on them making improvements to their nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, the negotiation strategy that's being proffered here today is guaranteed to fail. One, because we've already tried it and it failed. Two, because I've been at those negotiations in 2005 and saw how both Russia and China and North Korea are not serious about giving up their nuclear weapons program. Three, negotiating a peace treaty is not going to get us to the end result. A peace treaty will only give China and North Korea the excuse to ask American troops to leave the peninsula. And four, to be clear, a freeze, however you want to describe what that freeze looks like, is a dead end. That is not going to get us to denuclearization because the North Koreans, in their actions and in their words, have made clear they're not interested in negotiating away this nuclear program. What we need to start thinking about and talking about is whether this regime will ever give up its nuclear weapons program. And if the answer is no, then we have to start thinking about how do you increase sanctions to a level where this regime becomes unable to continue revenue to the military, revenue to the elites, and revenue to these weapons programs? And how do we get more information into the North Korean people to tell them what their regime is actually doing and how depressed they are compared to other countries outside of North Korea?
John Nielsen, right?
I think Anthony's right in highlighting the fact that the North Korean regime is not about to give up its nuclear assets. Now, this is one part of Kim Jong-un's agenda, a fairly simple agenda based on military strength and economic prosperity. So I think the world does have, unpalatably as it may be, to accept the reality that North Korea is not going to disarm. So that leaves us with, in a sense, the next best scenario, which is slowing down the progress that they're making, finding a mechanism which will delay their continuing advance in their technical capabilities. That's why the emphasis is on negotiations. But it's that second agenda item for Kim Jong-un, economic prosperity. You'll recall that in his New Year addresses, he said repeatedly to his own people, I will not only deliver economic and military strength, but I will guarantee that you will never have to tighten your economic belts again. He needs to deliver on that promise as well. His legitimacy is based on those two key factors.
Because in the past, there was starvation at one point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And increasingly, the residents of Pyongyang, admittedly, they're a small proportion of the overall population, see economic prosperity as part of their own personal futures. And if that is jeopardized, either as a result of economic sanctions or of failure on the part of the state planning mechanism, that will cost Kim Jong-un some of that political support.
All right, Anthony Ruggiero mentioning the Chinese and the Russians. This Tuesday, they've had different reactions to what's happened with this missile test. Let's first listen to Beijing.
Past experience has already proved that exerting pressure and using sanctions cannot fundamentally resolve this problem. The Korean Peninsula issue is intricate, complex, and long-standing. The only correct way to resolve it is via talks to address each other's security concerns.
All right, so no sanctions talks, say the Chinese. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, while on a visit to the UAE, striking a different tone.
Regarding North Korea and the missile test it's conducting, we stand by the resolution of the UN Security Council and we insist on the fact that our North Korean neighbors should fully respect those resolutions. We base our position on these statements during discussions in the Security Council and will do the same in this session, which as far as we understand will be dedicated to discussing the latest missile launches from North Korea.
So break this down for us, Dorian. Why?
Very smart Lavrov, as always. You know, the Russian diplomacy is really perfect. You know, that's funny because now at the UN there is the Security Council. You know, they start to talk. They are going to condemn again unanimously this missile launch, and then they already said that they won't start to talk about new sanctions, both China and Russia, before we started the show. And talking about the resolution, that's interesting. Lavrov said, okay, we have to respect the resolution and the sanctions. And just a few months ago, there is this new Russian ferry, opened the lines between Vladivostok and Rason in North Korea with passengers, with Chinese tourists, with Russian tourists, and with North Korean workers. They can commute from North Korea to Russia. Talking about sanctions, I mean, okay, Mr. Ruggiero logic is perfectly printed. I mean, it's obvious that it looks like perfect. But first, North Korea doesn't want to strike South Korea or Japan. They won't strike that. They won't start the war. Sanctions and diplomacy pressure so far didn't do much to stop. It slowed down a little bit, the programs. We don't know the agenda, actually, of the North Koreans about the programs, I mean, nuclear and missiles. I mean, they have, for many years, they have prepared so much. We don't know what they have in all the tunnels and underground. They can start and keep on working with the missile. They can build indigenously their own missiles now. They don't need foreigners now to do that. So I think it cannot be white or black, you know. It cannot be like they are the bad guys and we are the good guys. I mean, it's much more complex. And now we have to take them as they are, which is not easy, but it's a long term. I mean, the Chinese, of course, they try to abide by the sanctions, but they don't want North Korea to fail. I mean, you know, they need North Korea between the Americans and their own border. So, I mean, every actor in the region needs North Korea, actually. So far, nobody wants any change.
Every actor needs North Korea?
For many reasons. I mean, you can look at the Japanese. I mean, it's useful. I mean, but they need North Korea. They have the kidnapped. I mean, for the Russia, there is no peace treaty between Japan and Russia. I remind you, you know, they have to deal something, and there is the Northern Territories, so there is something there. For China, they don't want anything. For the Russian, it's very useful. So it's not like America, North Korea, and that's it. We are going to do that. There is no trust, from what I hear from Mr. Ruggiero. There is no trust. So what? So that means the only issue, I mean, the only outcome would be to start something more violent and military, you know, which is not like a good solution, I think.
Anthony Ruggiero, let me ask you to pick up on this point. With you heard Dorian there mentioning the opening of that ferry route between North Korea and Russia. You heard John Nielsen Wright talking about the promise of increased economic prosperity. It's one of the most reclusive regimes in the world. Yet it's opening up a little bit. Is that going to be the eventual downfall of the regime?
Well, you know, I thought it was interesting to hear Dorian talk about the missile program. I would say he's actually making my argument against the freeze. I mean, if North Korea has all these ballistic missiles underground and indigenously can produce them, then how do you verify a freeze? And how do you get a freeze to stop or roll back the program? And unfortunately, I can cite even more examples of North Korea building a nuclear reactor in Syria in the 2000s as we were negotiating with them. And they still got off North Korea was removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list after that. North Korea developing a uranium enrichment program in secret when we thought they were abiding by the agreed framework. So we have to understand that there are dangers here with negotiations and getting us, lulling ourselves into a false sense of security. In terms of economic prosperity, the South Koreans have given North Korea plenty of economic prosperity, whether it's the $100 million a year that North Korea used to get from the Kaesong industrial complex, which is a complex between North and South Korea where they were producing goods. And the reason it was created was some of what is being said here. This will help North Korea's economic prosperity. North Korea will see the value of capitalism and they'll see the way. What we learned, because the South Korean government itself said this, is that all of that money, most of that money, went to North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs. So I think it's not black and white, certainly. But when we look at Russia and China and what they are doing now, when we look at Russia, who has been working with North Korea entity Tangoon, which was designated by the UN in 2009, that is a North Korean proliferation entity, and they are providing metals and other supplies. So I don't see how it's any more black and white than that. You have Russian companies working with North Korea's proliferation program. I've written and spoken a lot about China's financial operations that are aiding North Korea's sanctions evasion. So excuse me if when I hear China and Russia talk about how other countries should be doing more, or in the case of Russia, how we should all be abiding by the UN resolution, that I automatically don't stand up and say, oh, thankfully now they are on board, because they are the primary problems when we look at this issue set.
John Nielsen Wright, you're either for or against Pyongyang?
Let's have no illusions. Pyongyang is a very bad regime, and there are lots of other bad regimes in the world, and the Chinese and the Russians, two authoritarian governments, Anthony's right, have not been good citizens when it comes to dealing with North Korea. So some of their rhetoric needs to be taken with a big pinch of salt. But we need to be pragmatic. America's power is limited. Its ability to enforce a global sanctions regime to put pressure on the North Koreans will undoubtedly have limits. And I think that's what we need to recognize. And we need to keep our focus on the short-term immediate goal of trying to slow down the North Korean missile capabilities. Anthony mentioned, the real threats from North Korea, not just its nuclear program, but its conventional forces. I completely underline the importance of taking that seriously, and the best way to combat that is through deterrence. But the issue that we're trying to deal with is the increasing reality that North Korea will become a real credible threat to the United States with its nuclear assets. We've had senators like Lindsey Graham saying very publicly, reflecting their own point of view and perhaps channeling the view of President Trump, that once North Korea reaches that tipping point, the Americans would have to be willing to go to war, ultimately sacrificing Seoul for the sake of America's strategic interests. That's the critical turning point we need to guard against. And anything that can slow down that movement towards that critical juncture, I would say, needs to be embraced as a strategy. And that includes talks, it includes shoring up deterrence, it includes using the United Nations. It may even include the use of propaganda to try and delegitimize Kim Jong-un's leadership itself. But that has to be coupled with incentives, carrots as well as sticks, so that you have a balanced, calibrated approach. This is what's been lacking in the Trump White House, a sense of a coordinated strategy. We've already seen that in terms of the internal division between the president and some of his military advisors. And that doesn't even begin to deal with the question of how you coordinate internationally. And the reason why North Korea can exploit that absent strategy, as we saw today, is that it knows how to time its interventions to both antagonize Donald Trump and to expose the lack of a coordinated approach on the part of the Americans.
We're going to leave it there for now. I want to thank you, John Nielsen Wright. I want to thank Anthony Ruggiero for being with us from Woodbridge, Virginia, Dorian Malovic. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. So obviously a lot of reactions on social media to the latest events. Taking a look, first of all, at some journalists who've been commenting on it in the US. 1 week ago, Trump and allies were claiming a victory on North Korea. This shows the danger of playing a short game with Beijing and Pyongyang. both play a long game. That's Jim Sciutto of CNN. Meanwhile, a CBS journalist, Pamela Falk, quoting the US ambassador to the UN. Enough is enough, said Nikki Haley. We are going to talk about what else is left to do to North Korea. We're seeing, this is Ian Bremmer, a political scientist at New York University, looking at the stock markets. Perhaps interesting to note that there hasn't been a huge amount of movement up and down on the stock markets, at least in terms of...
I'm always slightly skeptical about how much this has to do with stock market indices.
Perhaps. But in any case, that's being shared as well. Boris Johnson, of course, Foreign Secretary of the UK, outraged and reckless provocation by North Korea, strongly condemn latest illegal missile launch by the DPRK. Now, some have been digging out old tweets by Donald Trump, who, of course, was famously antagonistic in opposition. Some would say he's still a bit antagonistic in the White House. But
some say that, yeah.
Right. Here's a tweet from 2012, actually the 12th of the 12th, 2012. We can't even stop the Norks.
Norks, okay.
From blasting a missile. China is laughing at us. It is really sad. So, of course, we'll take note that that's 5 years ago almost. And somebody here saying, and so the gypsy woman said to him, I curse you to live out your old tweets the rest of your days. So, in any case, there is that. And, of course, Kim Jong-un not being spared either a degree of criticism on social media. This is, I believe, a send-up from Kenny from South Park, if I'm not mistaken. But I think
you're not mistaken.
I think perhaps real live leaders with nuclear weapons are perhaps more intimidating. This is a kind of a series of somewhat lighter tweets as well, because some are being ironic to some degree or another on social media as well. This isn't funny, I think. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 72 years ago, but Japan is apparently still being dogged by a fat man and a little boy. Now, that is, of course, they were the names of the nukes, or at least, I suppose, Japan certainly concerned about the fact that that missile was fired over the north of its territory. Another person here commenting, sending this directly to Kim Jong-un, saying, could you please calm down? Not being funny, but I need to see what happens in Game of Thrones. I actually saw a lot of people saying that. In other words, could we spare... a nuclear holocaust until after we've seen what happens.
The end of season 7.
Right. Not that.
And is there a real... Hold on, go back to that previous one. Is there a Kim Jong-un
Let's
Twitter
check.
account?
Probably, but there is, but it has never been used.
Okay, all right, okay.
So, in any case. Another person as well, just to finish with this, Game of Thrones, Make America Great Again. I hope it all works out. And this is somebody imagining, in fact, the actual geopolitical tensions that we're talking about here as... like something out of Game of Thrones. So there you go. That's a fire-breathing dragon, I believe.
It's quite amazing what you're saying. So in other words, you know how Trump's been bleeding into conversations for the last 5 months? It now seems as though Game of Thrones has superseded
it seems to... people seem to actually somehow care about it more, but in any case, I don't know what that says about general awareness of geopolitical threats. Anyway.
On social media.
On social media.
All right, James Green, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.